Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're unpacking the absolutely fascinating cognitive mechanics behind how we actually learn a second language. If you've ever tried picking up a new language, you already know it's this wild mix of thrilling breakthroughs and honestly incredibly frustrating roadblocks. So, we're going to look at the invisible blueprints your brain uses to construct a new language totally from scratch and, get this, why making mistakes is literally the most important part of the whole process. Okay, let's just validate a shared frustration right off the bat. Reaching absolute native-level fluency? It's incredibly rare. Foundational research in the field tells us that a mere 5% of adult learners actually go through the psychological processes needed to achieve true native speaker competence. Crazy, right? For the vast majority of us, learning a new language often feels like hitting this impossible plateau. But as you'll see, that plateau isn't a failure at all. It's actually a feature of a highly complex psychological system. Moving into part one, the language learning puzzle. So for decades, linguists and psychologists argued over the exact mechanisms that let humans take in a barrage of totally unfamiliar sounds and somehow output meaningful sentences. Early on, you had the behaviorist theory. They basically argued that learning a language was all about habit formation, right? You listen, you imitate, you get a pat on the back, and boom, a habit is formed. Mistakes were just seen as pesky bad habits from your mother tongue getting in the way. But researchers pretty quickly realized that didn't explain the whole picture. Enter the mentalist theory, championed by Noam Chomsky. This totally flipped the script, arguing that we don't just mimic like parrots. Instead, we are born with innate cognitive abilities, this universal grammar, that actively help us figure out the underlying rules of literally any language we encounter. Which brings us to part two, building the interlanguage bridge. To really grasp this puzzle, we have to look at your developing grammar as a literal bridge between your native tongue and your target language. The absolute crucial point here is that your mistakes are actually evidence of a highly sophisticated internal system. We call it your inner language. When you're learning a second language, you aren't just doing a bad job of speaking the target language. Actually, your brain has essentially invented a third completely hybrid language. And this inner language, it has its own strict rules and logic. It's systematic, meaning you're following your own internal grammar, and it's totally dynamic, constantly evolving as you take in more information. Back in 1972, Larry Selinker published this truly groundbreaking paper that first identified this built-in syllabus. He completely revolutionized the field by proposing that adult second language learners actually possess a latent psychological structure in their brains. So, when you try to express meaning in a new language, this structure fires up, actively driving you to create this unique interlanguage. Selinker broke down the construction of this mental bridge into 5 distinct cognitive processes. You can think of these as your brain's very own engineering tools. First up, you've got language transfer, where you just straight up borrow rules from your mother tongue. Then comes overgeneralization. Oh, this is a classic. It's like when a learner discovers the ed past tense in English and suddenly starts saying, I drived, instead of I drove. Your brain is just applying a perfectly logical rule a little too broadly. You also use learning and communication strategies. These are those clever mental shortcuts you take to memorize material or just to get your point across to a native speaker when you completely blank on the exact word. And finally, transfer of training. This happens when a specific rule is drilled into you by a textbook or a teacher, and you end up applying it in a totally unique, sometimes weird way within your interlanguage. Now, all of this taps directly into Chomsky's idea of a mental black box, where learners are actively testing hypotheses rather than just mindlessly repeating what they hear. Seriously, think of your brain as a little scientist. You take in this disordered, sometimes messy input from the world around you, and your internal language acquisition device subconsciously generates a hypothesis about how the grammar is supposed to work. If people understand you, awesome, you keep the rule. If they look at you totally confused, you reject it and try a new one. Other theorists, like Stephen Krashen, expanded on this whole idea. He impartially observed that getting comprehensible input and keeping your anxiety low might actually matter way more for natural acquisition than strict formal grammar instruction. Krashen noted this really important difference between subconsciously acquiring a language and consciously learning its rules. He also brought up the affective filter hypothesis. This points out a fascinating variable. If you have high anxiety or low self-confidence, it creates a literal mental block that prevents language input from even reaching your brain's processing centers. So relaxing is literally part of learning. And that leads nicely into part 3, why we get stuck. So if we have this incredible bridge building capacity and this built-in scientific hypothesis tester, why do so many of us hit that plateau? Well, this brings us to a phenomenon known as fossilization. This is the roadblock that answers our initial question about that wild 5% fluency statistic. Fossilization is basically when certain errors or non-native rules become permanently frozen right into your interlanguage. And the crazy thing is, even if you keep studying for years, these fossilized forms might vanish briefly when you're paying super close attention, only to pop right back up the second you start speaking naturally again. Fossilization happens because of a mix of internal factors, like age and the natural loss of brain plasticity, alongside external factors. And this is where it gets incredibly counterintuitive. One major external factor is actually positive feedback. Let's say you utter a grammatically incorrect sentence, but the native speaker just smiles and says, "Yep, I understand you." Boom, the communicative pressure is totally off. Your brain subconsciously decides, well, the message got through, so this grammar rule is good enough. And just like that, the error fossilizes. Let's explore this further in part 4, the transfer effect. Now, one of the main drivers of both our progress and our roadblocks is the transfer effect. You see, our first language acts like a permanent lens through which we view any new language we try to learn. In universal grammar, rules are basically separated into two camps: basic, natural rules, and complex, peripheral ones that take a lot more cognitive effort. We call the natural basic ones unmarked rules, like standard subject-verb-object order. Marked rules are the exceptions. They're the weird, complex things specific to a single language. For instance, looking at this, a sentence like, "You like music," follows a basic unmarked order. But to ask, "Why do you like music?" English suddenly requires this highly marked WH movement and throwing in the auxiliary verb do. And this brilliantly illustrates why a Spanish speaker might say "y student," or a Chinese speaker might struggle with English question structure. It's literally just your brain relying on the established rules of your first language. When the rules of your native language and the target language align perfectly, you get positive transfer. Like, Chinese learners have a massive advantage learning Japanese because they share similar written characters and meanings. But when those rules clash, you get negative transfer. A Spanish speaker might instinctively place the adjective after the noun, saying "the car red," or add an E sound to words starting with S, saying "y student." You have to remember, it's not a failure to learn. It's just your highly efficient brain trying to apply an old blueprint to a brand new building. Which brings us to our final section, part 5, treating errors and evolving. So how do we actually use this knowledge to evolve our language skills and avoid getting stuck in our interlanguage forever? Well, it raises a massive debate in pedagogy. Should every single error be treated? Think about it. If mistakes are just natural steps in testing hypotheses, does a teacher jumping in with a red pen actually help the learner? Or does it just spike their anxiety and block that affective filter we talked about? Researchers present a bunch of varying, impartial hypotheses on this. They note that adapting feedback to the learner's specific developmental stage and really encouraging self-repair is often way more effective than just a blanket correction of every mistake. Interestingly, studies show that teachers actually tend to correct discourse and vocabulary errors much more often than grammatical ones. But here's the truly fascinating takeaway. Error treatment is rarely successful immediately. But if a teacher guides a student to develop an autonomous ability to self-correct, over the long term, that learner will systematically update and upgrade their interlanguage grammar. It's a long game. So the absolutely crucial point here is that you should never, ever view a language plateau as a failure. Instead, what if you saw every single mistake as the vital architecture of your very own unique interlanguage bridge? The next time you stumble over a sentence, just remember, you aren't messing up a new language. You are actively engineering a brand new, highly complex linguistic system right inside your brain. And that leaves us with one final, pretty exciting question to ponder. If our brains are wired to continually build and revise these interlanguage bridges, what other hidden mental frameworks are we constructing right now without even realizing it?